5 reality shows. They talk about like this is, what's that? These are nice. Yeah, we can help that. I didn't do that. Distinguished. Who's that? Richard White's coming on the 21st. He wrote, yeah, he said, he's very prominent American historian, writes books about this. He wrote a little book called Remembering a Honeymoon. It's a biography of his mother. In the first class, doesn't say. Oh, okay. He has a cousin. A biography. And the first cousin wants to move. And I'm trying to, they never met. And I'm trying to get him here. And he will come. Oh, we never met. Because they're not the same generation. Yes. Yeah, the other guy's mother is his first cousin. And Richard's out in New Hampshire, so it's like whatever. Right. So I'm trying to get the person number 2. He will come if his heart comes out.
Well, if they're not. Doesn't look like that. There's a few here, but I'd be embarrassed if that was the front row.
There's a mask to set up first, John.
I know.
Like you put Joe there. Joe and his wife there.
It could be really George. Richard's very good all by himself.
Well, yeah, Joe, you should sit in the front there.
No, I'm with my bride here.
So we'll bring her here.
We'll get her.
Bring your bride.
Nick, was it 73 you arrived in the US? What year did you arrive?
62.
What year did you arrive in the US?
73.
73, I was right. That's a good guess. 62. He was playing with the Johnsons. He showed me this great thing that he dug out when he did. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How's everybody? You're ready? You're ready, so. My name is John Waters. I'm a faculty member here in Bluxton Ireland House, and I'm delighted you came out on this soon-to-be wet evening to hear the one and only Mick Moloney. First, a bit of business. You'll join me in making sure that we're not humiliated by an event, at an event like this with the phones going on. So if you could silence your phones with me now, we'll all do it together, and we'll all feel much better knowing that nothing terrible is going to happen. All sounds off. So we've taken care of that. Let me say a few words tonight. I'm delighted that our public event series is resuming again this evening with one in a series of events that we're doing this year on a topic chosen for our 25th anniversary series on relations between the Irish and the Jews. I want to invite you, be sure you know to come next Thursday as well, not on the theme of the 25th anniversary, but the wonderful Canadian, Irish-Canadian novelist Peter Behrens will be here to give a lecture on historical fiction and on his newest book, so I hope I'll see some of you in the audience next week. I'm not going to say a lot about Mick's illustrious career because I think the room is packed because you all know about that. That Mick came from here to the United States in 1973. He's originally from Limerick, as most of you will all know, and played with a few groups in England and in Ireland before emigrating to America to begin his PhD in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania. But Mick did something quite interesting and quite important, which was that upon his arrival here, he recognized that there was an extraordinary legacy of the musical tradition of which he was an inheritor that had been carried to this country and was being held and passed on by multiple generations of overlapping families and networks of people in the United States. And what Mick realized was that some of the great players in the history of the tradition were here in the United States, and that they hadn't been asked about what they were doing. They hadn't been recorded in most cases, and they hadn't been memorialized properly. So he got a big boxy tape recorder, and he set about traveling around the country finding all the great old players wherever they were. And that began, I think, a rather extraordinary work of not only of recovery, but also of sustenance. I think there's a principle in historical studies of the notion that recognition confers dignity and that it shares energy. And I think Mick has always had that at the forefront of his practice as a musician, but also as an ethnomusicologist, a historian, a folklore scholar, as an artist, but also as somebody who likes people and who is in it because, whatever he's in, because of the human contact that comes from the kind of work that he's pioneered, really, across disciplines, right? As a scholar of folklore, of music, of cultural history, and also really of performance. There's something that Mick recognized, I think, quite early on, even before the discipline of performance studies was housed in a university, was that performance studies was a way to think about a mode of being, a mode of taking ideas that one is given, but also theorizing them through practice. And this has become a very central idea in the way that the thinking about the arts and culture has gone in the last several decades. And that leads me to say one other thing about Mick, which is that he's been a talent spotter and a talent incubator. And a promoter is the wrong word because that word has been commercialized in a funny way. But if you ask around you in the tradition and the musicians, you'll know that Mick has been an indefatigable supporter of young musicians and of young talented musicians, and also a pioneer in bringing people from different musical traditions together. And that is something that, where I think that the fact that he's here in New York City, that we managed to get him, we pull him out of teaching at Villanova and at Georgetown, which he did for many years, and bring him here to New York was a stroke of genius on Bob Scally's part. And so Mick arrived here just before I did. I've not known NYU without Mick Moloney in it, and that has made an extraordinary difference in the way I think about the place and the way I think about my job. And that was driven home to me today. One of the faces I don't see in this room is a young scholar that Mick and I have both worked with, who is in our Masters of Arts in Irish and Irish American Studies program. She's finished last year. Her name is Caroline Tatum. She's not here because she's been offered one of the two fellowships to the PhD program in folklore at Indiana University in Bloomington, which is the premier folklore PhD program in the country. And Caroline did a fantastic path-breaking thesis on mumming and the mumming tradition in Armagh, among the Armagh mummers, and in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia mummers. And it's a thesis that bridges music and critical race theory and a whole range of different aspects of artistic and cultural practice. Supervised by Mick, and I know he joins me in being incredibly delighted to see a young scholar get that recognition and that step into it. As you'll know from this lecture that Mick's going to do about the Irish and the Jews, Mick has an extraordinary mind. I don't know anyone like it. No one does, actually. Mick's practice as an intellectual combines a spectacular memory, a gifted narrative style, a great sense of humor, and one of the distinctive features of being a storyteller in our tradition. So please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Mick Moloney.
I definitely want John Walters to speak at my funeral. Not for a while yet. Very honoured to be here. This is the 25th anniversary, of course, of the founding of this wonderful Dutchman Ireland House. And it's kind of a haven here, isn't it? I mean, when I came here first, and I was inviting students, to come along for office hours, they'd come in and they'd say why didn't I wear them? They felt underdressed, And it's a great honour to be asked to speak here tonight on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, indeed, because I wouldn't be in America were it not for a man who meant so much to me. I really can't put it into words. He was my mentor for years, and in many ways a role model that I feel pleased to emulate in whatever little way I can. And I refer to the late and great Professor Kenneth Goldstein, who was, among other things, president of the American Folklore Society. He was also the chairman of the folklore department at the University of Pennsylvania. I first met him in 1971 when I arrived in America, as I was a member of a group called the Johnsons at the time, and we'd experienced some success, I suppose, in Ireland and England, here to America, and we played at the Philadelphia Folk Festival and then promptly broke up, as groups do. And I stayed in Kenny's house for a while, discovered his extraordinary folklore library, which is really the one of a kind. It now is down in Mississippi, and should be visited by everybody, I suppose, who's interested in American popular culture and folk culture too. He never really honoured any artificial boundaries in academic life. He was interested in everything. And he was my first big influence in America. I went back then to England, was living in London, I became a housing social worker for a couple of years, and I don't know if any of you have worked in that field, but it often feels like you've fingered in the dike. And I enjoyed the work and I felt it was useful, but I knew I couldn't do it all my life. And then I met Kenny in the folk club in London, and he said to me, he always called me my boy. Now my boy, he says, what you should do is study folklore, he said. And I said, I've no money, I haven't a tosser. I said, I'm skint. I said, don't have two brass fardens to rub together. I said, how could I possibly go to school in America where you have to pay a small fortune to look in the door? And he said, apply for a scholarship, my boy. And I did. And I filled out all the paperwork and sent a big fat envelope over to the University of Pennsylvania and waited and waited, and then I got the letter back that no, unfortunately they couldn't offer me a scholarship. But then I decided not to sulk about it. I wrote a letter to Kenny thanking him for helping to focus my mind. I didn't know what in the name of God I wanted to do. And I said in the letter something to the effect that at least I knew now that my future, however murky it appeared at the time, would involve some mixture of being an artist and being a teacher, that I felt that I'd recognise whatever calling I might have. And I wrote him that letter, and I off it went. And then I got, about 3 weeks later, I got a letter back saying, "My boy, I loved your letter. I got you a special scholarship." So my future got shaped by an answer to a letter of rejection, a gracious answer. I suppose this should have been a lesson there for me for the rest of my life. But anyway, I came over to Philadelphia, didn't have any money at all. I sold a Volkswagen Beetle, so I had a little bit. But I lived with Kenny for a while, and I discovered a house full of hospitality and noisy, argumentative debate, and I felt very comfortable. There were a few cultural adjustments. I don't know, those of you who are Irish will know, but those of you who haven't been to Ireland might need to be reminded that we have very old-fashioned ways of carrying on when it comes to disagreements or even coming to an agreement. And if you go into a household, any household in Ireland, the first thing you'll be offered is a cup of tea. And the appropriate answer is no. No. And then they will say to you, go on, have a cup of tea. Then you hesitate slightly and say, "Well, I wouldn't want to put you to any trouble." Right? And they say, "Well, I'm making a cup of tea." And if you're making a cup of tea yourself, and you get a cup of tea. I came to Kenny's house, he said, "Hey, you want a cup of coffee?" I would say, "No, I didn't get a cup of coffee." This came as a great shock. In many ways, I've been adjusting ever since. But I loved arriving in an animated, hospitable, and sometimes disputatious Jewish household where there were no hidden agendas. And I loved that, and I still love it. And somewhere along the line, when I came to New York here, I got fascinated with the story of the Irish and the Jews in American popular culture, particularly in Tin Pan Alley. And Tin Pan Alley, I'll tell you about it a little bit later. That's a small vista of it. And I was aware by that point, starting off with my experience in Kenny's library, that the Irish had dominated American folk and popular culture for many, many decades in the 19th century. Thomas More, who sold more copies, I suppose, of books than I'd ever realised possible living in Ireland. He was just as popular here as he was in Britain and Ireland, and he wrote songs like The Last Rose of Summer, which was the #2 bestseller in all formats of any song in America in the 19th century. And then I discovered the troubled and troubling history of the Irish in America's first popular cultural form, which was minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy, and the Irish dominating that. And people like Dan Emmett, whose people came from County Mayo, and was born in Mount Vernon, Ohio. His grandfather was a surgeon in Washington's army. He came from Mayo, fairly well heeled. Dan Emmett became known, I suppose, best in American popular culture as the author of the song Dixie, which he wrote on a wet day here in New York in 1859. And he was astonished when it became the anthem of the South. In fact, when I go down and play anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line and inform them of that, it goes over like a lead balloon, I can tell you. And then, I suppose, the father of minstrel song, these people came from Foster's Glen in County Derry. Stephen Foster, a very troubled man, America's songwriter. We'll be doing a major tribute to Stephen Foster up in Symphony Space on the 27th of September. By the way, and it'll be a very multicultural thing. We have a lot of African American performers, and Foster, it's not very well known. He was an abolitionist and was very uncomfortable about becoming a minstrel songwriter. It was never his intention to be lumped in with racist ideology of any kind. But there's a lot of baggage, and I needn't go into it in this particular talk. But he again was Irish, and when he wrote "Oh Susanna," he changed American popular culture forever. And there's a great book written by my friend Ken Emerson called "Do That," how Stephen Foster changed the face of American popular culture. And lots of funny noises going on here. I don't know for the minstrel past coming to bother us. But when he wrote "Oh Susanna," he changed everything. The greatest number of copies any song had ever sold before "Oh Susanna" was 3,000. This sold 100,000 copies. For the first time, people were singing the same version of a song in San Francisco, in New York, in Boston, in New Orleans. and this very troubled and very tragic figure. We're going to celebrate his legacy and not leave anything out on the 27th of September. Ken Emerson will be there, and my great friend, African-American Lenny Stone. We'll ask the question, was Stephen Foster a racist? And we'll have answers, hopefully, and we'll have a lot of African-American performers. I learned about him. He's the biggest seller of all songs in the 19th century, Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair. John Brogum introduces the stage Irishman, a Dublin man, in the early 19th century, and with a swagger. And Tyrone Power, one of the first Tyrone Powers, was one of the great actors to appear in his plays. Dion Boucicault, the father of American theatre, he celebrated over in Tish as that, and he introduced touring companies and fireproof sets and a version of copyright law, ironically because he was one of the biggest plagiarists of the 19th century from Ireland. And Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore's band, the most famous brass band in America, tremendous legacy of music, band music, and he was both a stretcher bearer and a band leader in the Civil War, an extraordinary figure from County Galway. But the story of the earliest Irish-Jewish collaboration begins with this man, Ned Harrigan, born just where the Williamsburg Bridge now touches Manhattan, this at that time known as Corlear's Hook. His grandfather was a cod fisherman from County Cork who settled in Newfoundland, and his father, William Harrigan, he changed his religion from Catholic to Protestant, became ship's captain, and moved to New York. And Ned Harrigan was born 1844, the year before the Irish famine, and grew up in New York, became a minstrel. That was the thing. If you weren't a classical musician, you wanted to be on the stage, you blacked up, and you can't call any minstrel a racist with any degree of confidence because you don't know what they were thinking. But he teamed up with Tony Hart, who was the son of family immigrants from Clare Island in Worcester, Massachusetts. His name was Anthony Cannon. They became known as Harrigan and Hart. And then Harrigan met David Braham. David Braham was a member of a very musical family from England. The ancestral name was Abraham. The A was dropped because of anti-Semitism in London. And the Brahams were famous as pit orchestra leaders. David Braham was often known as the Offenbach of America, a very gifted writer of melodies, a gifted conductor. And Braham and Harrigan and Hart, the combo was irresistible. Long before Gilbert and Sullivan was even a notion, they dominated and invented musical theatre here in New York City and indeed anywhere in the world, bringing together comedy and bringing together action, recognizable figures, and of course songs. David Braham and Ned Harrigan wrote 300 songs, over 300 songs, mostly about tenement life here in the Lower East Side of New York. And then Ned Harrigan married David Braham's daughter, Annie Braham. They had a love affair, and it was one of the great relationships of the 19th century. The paparazzi couldn't find any chink at all in it, and they got tired of inventing any notion that Ned Harrigan was anything other than a dutiful father and a great husband, and in fact indeed a great partner to Annie Braham. Their theatre was just north of Waverley Place, by the way, and Annie was kind of the manager, and David Braham and Ned Harrigan and the whole lot. They all lived in one big house, and it started off. The first big house was in the corner of Carmine and Bleecker, where songs like the Mulligan Guard were written as part of a big play, really celebrating target companies and the Irish involvement in them after the Civil War. And this is one of the first big songs that Harrigan and Hart wrote. 1873 became the hit of the year.
We'll tell you what we know of marching in the Mulligan Guard when the Sligo war below. Our captain's name was Hussey, a Tipperary man. He carried his sword like a Russian duke whenever he took a man. Forward! March! We shouldered guns and marched away. From Baxter Street we marched to Avenue Bay. Our fifes and drums so sweetly they did play as we marched in the Mulligan Guard.
This song even appears in Rudyard Kipling's Kim, set in India. He has a British regimental band playing the Mulligan Guard. He had no idea, that old imperialist, that it was written by an Irish American and a Jewish collaborator. And he'd probably turn in his grave if he knew. This was the kind of setting that they had to the plays. It represented, Tyler Ambinder used this as a kind of an inspiration, and indeed the Gangs of New York came out of this kind of setting of tenement life. You could look at this for a long time. This is a miniaturization of a backdrop to one of the plays. It's the song that comes out of it is McNally's Row of Flats. But look at the detail. This is a miniaturized version of a huge theatrical backdrop. You could stare at this for hours looking at different things, and indeed I have. And I still see new things about it. And I suppose you've mostly been to the Tenement Museum, have you? You know, in the sense that this is, of course, that's from the edge of the 5 points. But this is what Harrigan and Brain wrote about was tenement life. I'll give you a verse of this. It's a great song.
Down in Bottle Alley lived Timothy McNally, a decent politician and a gentleman at that. Beloved by all the neighbours, the gossoons and the babies that occupy the building called McNally's Row of Flats. And it's Ireland and Italy, Jerusalem and Germany, Chinese and Africans and a paradise for rats, all jumbled up together in the snow and rainy weather. They constitute the tenants in McNally's Row of Flats.
And the fiddler in that is the great Athena Turgis, who's here tonight. So I was amazed when I came to New York. I learned about Ned Harrigan from Kenny Golson. I thought everybody in New York would be celebrating Ned Harrigan. I came here and nobody knew who Ned Harrigan was. And nobody would know who Ned Harrigan was. I suppose if it weren't for the song written by Georgian Cohan as part of one of his early plays, 50 Miles from Boston, which is of course Providence, where he was born. And the song, I bet you all of a certain vintage know it. H-A-R-R-I-G-A-N spells Harrigan, need I tell you? And that was Ned Harrigan, because Harrigan was Cohan's hero. And Cohan was about building, of course, and he would, any day off, he'd go and sit in the front seat of a Harrigan play, and that's who the Harrigan was. Things changed. 1892, this man arrives as a boy in Philadelphia, a man called Al Dubin. His father was a physician. He was exiled from Russia to Zurich, Italy by a pogrom, and then eventually came from Zurich to Philadelphia, fairly well heeled. And he sent young Al, to the best of schools, but Al wasn't having any education, formal or otherwise. He wanted to be a songwriter. And he got expelled from a lot of schools, and the last one from Keohane Seminary outside Philadelphia. And he was expelled for drinking and womanizing at the age of 16. This fellow was he moves to New York, and he teams up with a songwriter, two of them, one is John O'Brien and Al Dubin, Irish-American, and the first big hit he had was this song.
Oh, you should have seen the sights I saw, 'twas just the other night. Oh, you never saw the likes of it, 'twas such a pleasing sight. I was happy for a moment, but now I'm feeling blue. For what I saw I'll see no more, 'twas too good to be true. Oh, the shamrocks are blooming on Broadway. Every girl is an Irish colleen, and the streets of New York are the county of Cork. All the buildings are painted green. Sure, the Hudson looks just like the Shannon. Oh, how good and how real it did seem. I could hear mother singing, the sweet Shandon bells ringing. 'Twas only an Irishman's dream.
One of the first big Irish-Jewish combos in America was those two songwriters with Al Dubin writing the words. He was a great, like Ned Harrigan, a great wordsmith. He wrote these great songs like O'Brien is trying to learn to talk of wine and food. I mean, how could you resist that? Al Dubin and Rennie Cormack, the Irish-Jewish combo. And he became great friends with Victor Herbert, and indeed helped found ASCAP, I suppose to this day it's the greatest copyright protection for songwriters in the world. And he actually wrote a very, very difficult song, Indian Summer, to Victor Herbert's melody. It was a tour de force, really. And he never lost his Jewishness, you know. And Joseph Burke, he teamed up with Joseph Burke, and my Yiddish Butterfly was the least of their creations. They were the first songwriting team to be hired by the movie business. And they moved out, before the Depression, they moved out to Beverly Hills. And they lived like kings out there, and they had a contact with Warner Brothers, and as Jimmy Cagney did, as well. And they were hugely successful, and they lived like royalty. Al Dubin was a very controversial character. Never would get in an airplane at any time. He'd always travel across the country by train and get off in Albuquerque and go down to Mexico. And he boasted that most of his best songs were written in Mexican brothels. This fellow was a bit of a character. And in Gold Diggers of Broadway, he wrote one of his biggest early hits, and I'm sure you'll recognize the singer. Joe Burke got lonesome from Philadelphia. I mean, who would? Did you watch the Eagles? Who wouldn't get lonesome from Philadelphia? Teamed up to Harry Warren, and they became incredibly successful members of ASCAP. When they wrote the Lullaby Broadway, at that time, 5 out of the top 10 songs in America were written by Warren and Dubin, and been incredibly successful songwriters. Now, this was the era of Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley was 28th and Broadway, many of you probably know that. And it was where all the publishing companies were located. The music business was all over the joint in America in the 19th century, but 1892 it moved to New York, and the name is the Jewish publishers for the most part up in 28th and Broadway, and you see these are other vistas at that time. The term Tin Pan Alley was invented almost accidentally, like the term Celtic Tiger. A journalist said it twice or wrote it twice, and suddenly we're all talking about the Celtic Tiger. Same thing with Tin Pan Alley. Monroe Rosenfeld, who was a very successful songwriter at the time, who wrote a lot of Irish songs, like Paralyzed the Man That Says McGinty was one of his songs. He wrote that going up to 28th and Broadway, hearing all the piano players play for the pluggers who were trying to get the song sung by the Broadway stars. He said it was like tin cans banging together, tin pans, Tin Pan Alley. And it was known, he wrote dreadful songs, but they all had great titles, like this one and this one here. I love this one. And there's always a disturbing echo. We've had discussions here, and we will have more on minstrelsy, the fallout from minstrelsy, and then the whole issue of race in American society, and that needs to be an ongoing source of study among people who were interested in American culture of any kind, and indeed American society of any kind. And you had songs like this in the Pan Alley era proliferating. And indeed, at that time, sheet music is where the big money was. The recording industry is invented by Edison in 1879 out in New Jersey. He thought he was inventing a dictaphone, no idea what it would become. But it still wasn't the medium through which people made a fortune in the music industry. It was basically writing sheet music. This time, the sales of pianos after the Civil War rocketed, and nearly every American middle-class home had a piano or an organ. Ned Harrigan's last great hit was "There's an organ in the parlour to give the house a tone, and you're welcome every evening in Maggie Murphy's home." The organ in the parlour to give the house a tone. So people, it was just before we became passive consumers in America. We were still active producers of art, whatever the quality might be. Sitting around the piano, that's where the sheet music was articulated, that's where the art was created, and it was this strange amalgam of popular and traditional culture. That's why Kenny Goldstein never honoured those artificial distinctions that we make between aspects of culture. This was an era now where American popular culture was starting to become, I suppose, shaped by the forces that really commercialised the stage here in New York City in particular, when Broadway became, somewhere associated with American culture at its commercial zenith. Florence Ziegfeld, he was born in Chicago. He was Jewish, but he always kept it hidden. His mother was raised Jewish in Europe, and even in the movie The Great Ziegfeld, there's not even any articulation of his Jewish background. He was always very uncomfortable with the German Jewish. He wanted to distance himself from the Russian Jews who came later, that people theorized. But he ended up changing the way that popular culture was to be shaped in New York City forever.
The Broadway musical has always been a unique mix of high art and low, music and comedy, business and show. In its earliest days, one production above all brought together a variety of theatre traditions, combining song, dance and comedy in one extravaganza, the Ziegfeld Follies.
We still hear these great stories about his shows and how perfect they were and how chic they were and how stylized and how beautiful and how artistic they were.
When the curtain would rise on the Ziegfeld Follies, first and foremost you'd see spectacular settings, the like of which you'd never seen before, shimmering with color and light. Then we bring out the ladies of the ensemble.
There were grandiose and beautiful production numbers, which were Ziegfeld's favorite part of the show. The novelty acts, the sketches, and then the tableau vivant.
They were gorgeous girls and they were vaguely undressed, but the whole thing was innocent and very American.
Ziegfeld made a myth of the American extravaganza. It was abundance of talent, abundance of design, airtight to the curtains. Everything was absolutely the best that money could buy, and that's what he sold.
The joy of Ziegfeld is that he is his own best creation. Florence Ziegfeld, impresario extraordinaire.
In 1893, a 26-year-old first-generation American named Florence Ziegfeld Jr. came to Broadway looking to secure an act for the Chicago World's Fair. When Ziegfeld arrived in New York that spring, there were no theaters north of 42nd Street. Longacre Square at Broadway and 42nd was nobody's idea of the crossroads of the world. At the edge of the Tenderloin, an area of stables and brothels, It was notorious for horseplay. There was plenty for Ziegfeld to see, however, much of it on Broadway, just farther downtown. There were blackface minstrel shows, knockabout comedy acts from vaudeville, and lots of European-style operettas with beautiful maidens and heroic princes. The least expensive amusements were located a few blocks east of Broadway on the Bowery, where all sorts of boisterous routines amused the hard-working immigrants of the Lower East Side.
The audience are the ethnic minorities who have moved into New York City. And so one way to appeal to those minorities is to have comic sketches and songs that caricature ethnic stereotypes. Italian jokes, Irish jokes, Jewish jokes, but by being made fun of on stage, they're being included in America.
Florence Ziegfeld ultimately hired a performer from Broadway, from the Casino Theatre on 39th Street. Appearing in Adonis, Eugene Sandow couldn't sing or dance, but he could attract a crowd.
Ziegfeld makes his first mark with a weightlifter, bodybuilder, and gorgeous physiqued man named Sandow, who virtually took the fair by storm. He wore as little as possible to keep the censor out the door. Women were passing out by touching his muscles. Ziegfeld had a healthy understanding that sex sells. And that was an important part of everything that he did.
In 1907, Florence Ziegfeld found the formula that would make him Broadway's greatest showman. Called simply The Follies, Ziegfeld's revue took the French Folie Bergère and made it American.
One of the people he introduced to New York as a singer, as a performer, was Norah Bayes. Her origins are shrouded in mystery to this day. May have been born in Joliet, Illinois, may have been born in Milwaukee, and we don't know. Maybe we will know someday. But she arrives in New York, taking it by storm. We've had a couple of Irish stars, Maggie Klein, singing songs like Throwing Down McCluskey, but she was one that eclipsed everybody. She was like the ultimate femme fatale. Her first big hit was, has anybody here seen Kelly? You probably know the song. It seems to be part of the New York DNA. Is anybody here sing Kelly? I keep getting asked to sing it, and sometimes I do. I love the song myself. Here's Norah Bayes, and she becomes the darling of Irish America, not just by that song, but when she copies John McCormack on the Victor label, where he's already a huge success, the finest operatic singer in the world, maybe perhaps Enrico Caruso, they're maybe equal, but she copies John McCormack singing on this Victor recording, and lyrics by Ray Gotts, a Jewish songwriter, and Jean Schwartz. She becomes America's most popular singer in April 1917 when Woodrow Wilson declares war on Germany, and on that same day George Cohan comes in from Long Island on the train, and in a work of absolutely breathtaking genius, he sings what America is longing for at the time, I suppose, a patriotic song, and it's the most patriotic song, I suppose, ever written. And it starts with a 3-note bugle call. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Just 3 notes. And that's a mark of total genius. He gives the song to Norah Bayes, sells 1 million copies in 1 week.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, everyone forever. Hurry right away, no delay, someday. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to fight, to be proud of her boys in line. Over there, over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The rum coming everywhere.
Well, you know the song. And then she records one of the most difficult songs that you could possibly sing. It's commissioned by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the AOHs of the USA. This is almost impossible to sing. Just try it.
You belong to any order or any big society, like the Keohane or the Keohane, or any club keeps me the agency. If you don't, here's why I ask you. I know the one you should belong. Your little bread when you're right. They're even with you when you're wrong. The AOHs of the USA. There's a bunch of men today.
And it gets worse. She's now the absolute, unadorned darling of Irish America, and she marries Jack Norwood at marriage number 2. But there's a problem. He's very talented. He's very successful. He's a Pan Alley songwriter. But she always insists on being billed above him. Sometimes with the caption, Norah Bayes assisted and admired by Jack Norwood. It doesn't take him too long to exit stage left permanently, but not before he writes a song that every one of you has sung. And I'll buy a pint for anybody who's not called Joe Quinlan or John Waters or Ted Smith if you tell me what that song is that you've all sung. Jack Norwood's most famous song. You're not getting a pint. Take me. There you go. And this is Norah Bayes, the darling of Irish America. She's had 5 husbands by the time she's ended matrimonial pursuits, and she dies very young, in her 40s. She dies penniless, like a lot of Pan Alley stars or Broadway stars. The candle burns bright and doesn't burn that long. And when she's buried in Mount Sinai Cemetery, we find out that she's not Norah Bayes, she's Norah Goldberg. And she's kept it secret all the time. She gets into the business when it's mostly Irish. And you can only change your name once. You're only allowed to do that once in showbiz, for whatever reason. And then we find out she's Jewish. Doesn't matter at all. But I mean, at the same time, there's another story. George Michael Cohan, born on July the 3rd, 1878 in Providence, Rhode Island. And his father's name was not Cohan at all, it was Keohane, and his father came from Cork. He saw the way the business was going and said, we better change the spelling. And you won't see any Cohan spelled like that in the directory in Ireland, outside of Dublin. There's a population of 1,000 Jewish people in Dublin. You might see a Cohan in Dublin, but you won't see it in Limerick. So a lot of people think George M. Cohan is Jewish, and it's because his father has deliberately masked the identity with a name change. The 4 Cohans, they started as vaudevillians in Rhode Island.
of the modern theatre district was created on April 8, 1904, when the City Fathers renamed Longacre Square in honor of the newspaper, the New York Times. Times Square became the heart of New York when the subway station opened there 6 months later, bringing in visitors from all over the city. The subway made the Broadway musical available to a wide audience, which quickly became enamored of a wisecracking but patriotic Irish American. His name was George M. Cohan.
Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me to Herald Square. Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I will soon be there. Mr. Cohan.
George M. Cohan, with his energy, was the most incredible performer that ever was on a stage.
Give my regards to old Broadway.
I only saw him once in 1937, and he must have been 60 years old, and I saw him in I'd Rather Be Right, and even then he was amazing.
All George M. Cohan ever wanted to do from practically the minute he was born is to be on stage. They brought him up for a bow when he was like maybe 1 or 2 years old. And I think that's all he ever really cared about or knew was the audience and the theater.
Cohan was the song and dance man, and he was a brilliant song and dancer and came out of vaudeville. Vaudeville was an essential training ground for Broadway musicals.
Vaudeville was very much the individual performer and the individual act. You came on, you did your song, you did your juggling act, your dog act, your family act, whatever. But it was the focus on the individual performer.
Some of these people would spend their whole lives developing 12 minutes of material.
Vaudeville shows were America's most popular entertainment at the beginning of the century. Prices were cheap, but the variety of the acts was enormous.
In the ideal vaudeville program, there is a source of complete satisfaction for everybody present, no matter how mixed the audience may be. Just as in every state and city, in every county and town in our democratic country, there is an opportunity for everybody. A chance for all. E.F. Albee.
An Irish husband and wife vaudeville team, Jerry and Nellie Cohan, gave birth to their son, George M., in 1878, though not on the 4th of July, as he would always claim. Cohan never attended school, but toured the country in a family act. Even with top billing, Cohan wanted more than the vaudeville stage could offer. And in 1904, he made it on Broadway with Little Johnny Jones, where he served as its writer, composer, and star. The show premiered at the Liberty Theatre, just 1 block from the Times Square subway station that had opened 11 days earlier. Cohan won the crowds over with a flashy, patriotic character, which one critic called a vulgar, insolent, smart aleck.
George M. Cohan was, by all accounts, somebody who was scoundrel. He was an impossible human being. But he was a tremendous actor, comedian, showman, and he wrote great popular songs, and I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Yankee Doodle to all time. I realize that you are my Uncle Sam, born on the 4th of July.
And he sits now in most of our memories, not as George M. Cohan himself, but as James Cagney in the movie.
Yankee Doodle came to London just to ride the ponies. I am the Yankee Doodle boy.
managed to capture this stage persona that Cohan created. It was brash, it was pushy, it was aggressive, it was funny. Very American, very New York. And Cohan created this character as his own persona on stage, but it really became kind of the emblem of Broadway itself.
You know, the person speaking there is Philip Furia, and I love his writing. He wrote The Poets of Pan Alley, one of the great books on songwriting in America, and he also wrote he wrote two biographies of Irving Berlin, and says eminently sensible things. He also makes the point that Cohan came along at a time that America really needed him, in a sense, to coalesce a kind of a national feeling of unity that perhaps had never existed, where the wounds of the Civil War were still very much part and fabric of what it meant to be American. And suddenly you have this war where we're all united, as you can well imagine. Not many Americans wanted to enter this war, and Irish Americans weren't too keen. German Americans certainly weren't too keen. And yet, when Woodrow Wilson declared war, there was a national unity that perhaps never had existed up to that time. Cohan is perfect for that era. Over There is the perfect song. Nothing happens by accident or in a vacuum. It's the song for the time, and Cohan is the figure, the bellicose kind of jingoistic Yankee Doodle Dandy figure. I'm fascinated with Jimmy Cagney as well. I don't know if any of you saw the play Cagney. It was played up did you see it? It was a fantastic play, I thought. Did you like it? I really loved it. And Cagney, I'm fascinated with him, read everything about him and everything he wrote. But there's one thing he said that I think he fibbed more than a little bit. He said that when he had to do the dance for the Yankee Doodle Dandy, which had to be supervised by Cohan, who was still alive at the time, and he had to pass on it, and he did. He thought Cagney was a great talent. He said he had basically invented. He was fibbing. Now Cagney was involved in minstrelsy. Nearly every performer at some point was involved with minstrelsy. I mean, Gilmore, a great band leader, had a minstrel troupe as well. It's part of the uncharted territory of race relations in America that needs to be brought out. We need to air it out. The full story. There's redemption in truth, and certainly in art. And Cohan would never have been as successful as he was had he not met Sam Harris, his Jewish counterpart on the Staten Island ferry. They became lifelong friends. It was very hard to be friends with George and Cohan. He fell out with everybody. But they were lifelong friends. And they had a minstrel troupe. And Cohan himself, when he appeared in the presidential candidate, the only movie he was in, he did this dance.
Don't you waver, just let her wave. She's a grand old flag, and don't let her rag. Maybe someone wants to wave the flag.
Cohan is in his 50s now, dancing like this. The snozzola who's there on the piano. Cohan wrote incredible songs. I mean, they were brilliant songs. He was a great man for the first lines, like Thomas Moore, Believe Me for all these endearing young charms, the minstrel boyhood war is gone, when you come back, and you will come back, from old Broadway to Frisco Bay, one day all over the USA. And Cohan writes songs like this. And this was the era for anti-war songs. This was the biggest successful song in America in 1916. The person who recorded Morton Harvey never got a gig after we entered the war. Never got a gig after, and it was replaced by songs like America, Here's My Boy. And Fágtha Balla, Jewish songwriters are taking over. Fágtha Balla, which means clear the way. Ed Rose and Abe Allman, two Jewish songwriters, writing a song in the Irish language. At least from Irish language name.
they're white and it means to clear the way. It's Irish as can be, and it scares the enemy, for when they hear this battle cheer, it's goodbye Germany. Fog and bother, the Dublin boys are here. Fog and bother, just listen to them cheer. We'll carry on till the last one is gone, and even then we will come again just to help the boys along by singing fog and bother. There's something trouble in Dublin and bygone, we know just who, for we'll march right through like the Irish always do, and we'll sing fog and bother in the morning.
Fog and bother, there's something trouble in Dublin. Maybe the worst line in Tin Pan Alley's history of Tin Pan Alley songwriting. But at the songs now, the business is being taken over by Jewish songwriters. And I've often talked to Jewish friends of mine about this whole issue. And the answer, one of the answers, the possible answer is very simple. We've been in the music business, and popular music business is always kind of déclassés on the edge of society. I mean, how you come to the notion of marginality is ask the question, do I want my daughter to marry one of those? And if whatever those is undesirable, that's marginal. That's one of the ways you can define sociologically marginality. Popular songwriters, not too desirable. The whole lifestyle, I mean, the mores are different and so on, theatre is the same. Popular songwriting and popular culture, always somewhat on the déclassé side. We come to the title of tonight's talk. It wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. Jean Schwartz was one of the writers, Hungarian refugee, Jewish refugee. And William Jerome, I always thought he was Jewish, but he was not. In fact, it was William Flannery. And his father knew the way the business was going and changed the name. And there's Jerome and Schwartz and the song. They wrote, this song sold 1 million copies, the Irish coon song, Surname, Bedelia. Race never leaves the picture, and we can't idealise any of this stuff. It's an issue we always have to take account of. And My Irish Molly O, which was a big hit in Ireland in the 1980s, written by Jerome and Schwartz as well. My Irish Rosie, Jerome and Schwartz. They made their living writing Irish-American Tin Pan Alley songs, and the Irish and the Jews. I'll play just a little bit of this. I don't want to go on too long with the songs, but this is the song title. I love this song.
I've just returned from Europe, I've seen London and Paris, and I'm glad to get back home to Yankee land. In fact, the little USA looks better now to me. It's the real place where the real folks understand. But still I often sit and think, what would this country do if it hadn't been like Rosenstein and Hughes? We surely had a kingdom, maybe no democracy, if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. What would this great Yankee nation really ever do if it wasn't for a Levy, a Monaghan or Donahue? Where would we get a policeman? Why, Uncle Sam would have the blues. Without the Pats and Isidores, there'd be no big department stores. It wasn't for the Irish and the Jews.
And one of my favourite songs that they wrote was They're All Good American Names. The men who lead the world today in all athletic games are brawny sons of Uncle Sam with good old Yankee names. Brady and O'Toole, Doolan and McCall, McElmany and McBarney, Harrigan, McVeigh and Carney, Connie Mack and John McGraw. All together, shout hurrah! There's Rosenheimer, Jacobs, Wyman, Gimbel, Saxon, Strauss. They're all good American names. Now this was subversive stuff at that time, you know, in a WASP-dominated kind of elite culture, and they were very much in your face with their lyrics. Jerome and Schwartz, the greatest songwriting team, I think, of that era. There were also other great songwriters who made their living writing Irish-American songs. Harry Van Tilzer, wasn't Harry Van Tilzer at all, Harry Gumbinsky from Cincinnati, and Jewish immigrants, and they changed their name for euphonious reasons, I suspect. They took their mother's maiden name and they stuck in a Van to suggest a baronet kind of connection. And the two Van Tilzers, they made their livings writing Irish-American Tin Pan Alley songs like this one here. Andrew Sterling, who actually, he was one of the songwriters in Meet Me in St. Louis, Top of the Morning, Bridget McHugh. And the publishing houses, they're all Jewish at this time. Von Tilzer was one of them, Simon Water, and so on. And all the theatre owners at this point, we're talking the mid-20s, are all Jewish. I've talked to many friends of mine who are Jewish about this. It was a natural progression. The Irish had been around as immigrants for a long time, had been in the music business a long time. We're moving out of it into business, into Wall Street, universities, Notre Dame, Boston College, you can go on, St. John's, Villanova, Georgetown. We're making our mark in other aspects of American society. We're moving out of popular entertainment. Jewish immigrants who've arrived in force from the 1890s onwards are taking to this like ducks to water, like the Irish did earlier. And it's a logical progression. It's the very nature of American society, competition and moving on as ethnic groups come. And entertainment and sports have always been a way of rather quick mobility for Americans who are on the outskirts of society, on the margins, if you will. There are still a lot of Irish performers around, and this is the most celebrated performer in the Palace Theatre. Was the home of vaudeville, like Carnegie Hall was the hall in New York, and the Palace Theatre was the home of vaudeville for 50 years. Only closed down in the Great Depression. The biggest name in the Palace Theatre was Walter C. Kelly, born in Philadelphia, one of the famous Kelly families, and the uncle to Grace Kelly. He was the one who introduced her to Alfred Hitchcock out in California. The rest, as I say, is history. Gallagher and Sheen, you would think they were an Irish comedy duo. Gallagher. Sheen is not Sheen, he's Schoenberg from Eastern Europe. And I'll buy another pint for anybody who tells me who's his most famous nephew. Groucho. And then the biggest theatrical hit in the history of Broadway comes in the 1920s, the mid-1920s. Abbey's Irish Rose, written by Anna Nichols, she's from Georgia. First woman to produce and direct and write a Broadway musical. I mean, it was very much a male field. And it's a roaring success. After the First World War, you could argue that America is ready for a kind of a modicum of multiculturalism and pluralism, and Irish and Jews were perfect for that mix. We were not ready for any racial mix of another kind. I mean, blacks and Irish, inconceivable then. So you have Abbey's Irish Rose written, and the theme is a Jewish soldier in the First World War, Abraham Levi, is wounded in battle, and he's tended to by a nurse who's Rosemary Murphy. She's an Irish Catholic nurse, and they fall in love, and they get married in Europe by a Baptist minister. They move to New York, and he introduces his wife. This is the theme of the play as Rosemary Murkowski. But his father's an Orthodox Jew. He's not having any. He spells it out. He says, at least he says you've disgraced the family, but he says we might at least have a wedding by a rabbi. So the rabbi arrives, but meanwhile her father enters the picture, and a Catholic priest arrives, and then they get married a total of 3 times. And that gives a license for every ethnic joke and stereotype to be played out on the stage. It was panned by the critics as the worst play ever to hit Broadway, and the more it was panned, the more audience it got. And the biggest roaring success in the history of Broadway, this Irish-Jewish play. It morphs into a series of films, and I have 3 of the films. I bought them from this dude in England who specialises in peddling old silent movies and movies in the talkie era. The Cohans and the Kellys. It's lawsuits between them, and then the whole thing goes south in the Great Depression anyway. But the Cohans and the Kellys and Abbey's Irish Rose and all the music industry, the Jews and the Irish are centred in popular culture. It's an acceptable union. And again, all the stereotypes. If you try to get hold of the Cohans and the Kellys in Atlantic City, every single stereotype is played out, but because it's family, it's okay, at least in the context of the movies. I'm going to play you this, and I'll play this in its entirety. It's a 4.5-minute piece, and it's I think the pinnacle of popular culture at that era. Moshe Oisher was a Jewish cantor. Well, he wasn't to start with. He was a descendant of 6 generations of Jewish cantors in Russia. And he follows his father to Canada, ends up in Montreal, and ends up in Yiddish theatre in Montreal. After his voice breaks, he ends up in Yiddish theatre. Then he comes down to Philadelphia, ends up in Yiddish radio, moves to New York, to Brooklyn, just after the Depression, and becomes a central figure in Yiddish theatre. And then moves from there into the sacred realm, becomes a cantor himself, and crosses over all these boundaries. The first popular singer ever to do so, as far as my Jewish historian friends tell me anyway. And this is a tribute to ingeniousness really in creating a new genre, which was, I think, the pinnacle of popular singing at that time, of popular culture. It comes out of Tin Pan Alley, elements of ragtime, elements of jazz in it as well, and this is a tribute by the three Jewish cantors to Moshe Osher. One of my favourite pieces of music, I play it all the time. I think that's absolutely astonishing. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I played that just for the sheer pleasure of listening to all the vocalizing. We have an expert here. Where does that tradition come from? It comes from, there's a Sephardic element to it, there's the Eastern European cantorial tradition, there's popular culture, there's jazz, there's everything Tin Pan Alley has. But I don't want to lay some heavy musicological jargon. The adjacent chromatics, you know, if you were to take the piano and play all the notes along all these adjacent notes that are not in particular keys or modes even. And you know, when Dizzy Gillespie or Duke Ellington play the two notes beside each other on the piano, it's kind of wrong, but it's not. It becomes right from that moment onwards. This is culture. This is the crucible of America, and this couldn't have happened anywhere else but here. And it's a kind of a paean. It's always an ode to what America can produce in popular culture, and crossing the secular and sacred realm. These are the songwriters of the era that have left their imprint on the world, from Tin Pan Alley, Jerome Kern. Al Jolson as a singer and a songwriter, although, again, uncomfortably, he's better known like this than like that. And Oscar Hammerstein, always looked grouchy in the pictures, Oscar Hammerstein. George Gershwin, I met no direct descendants, but they're members of the Gershwin Trust I met in San Francisco when I performed with Tina out there. Remember, we performed at the Jewish Cultural Museum out there, and the Gershwins came, the Gershwin Trust people came along, and they were delighted to have this ode to Tin Pan Alley in a way that this little presentation represents. There was another side, Arnold Rothstein. He made Al Capone look like a sort of school teacher. You watched Boardwalk Empire, I'm sure many of you did, and Vince Giordano and the gang doing the music for that. But I mean, Arnold Rothstein could not have been the formidable figure he was without three Irish mayors, and Big Tim O'Sullivan, and Charles Murphy, and the jazz mayor Jimmy Walker. I mean, they were all impeached, and they were all basically contributors to the finances and the well-being of Arnold Rothstein. There's other, I mean, less dark sides to the story. George Byrne and Gracie Allen, and George Byrne said famously, another Irish-Jewish combo, he says he met Gracie Allen and asked her how she was, and she didn't shut up for 28 years. And this picture here is of the son of a Jewish cantor, Israel Baleen. The Jewish cantor arrives in New York in 1892, and he's sickly. He never gets to practice as a cantor, and he dies young. And this Israel Baleen has to take care of the whole family. One of the things he does, ironically, is act as a singing waiter in an Irish bar with a brothel overhead, and singing George and Cohan covers. People thought, well, stick with it, you might be a success. This picture was taken 1 month before Israel Baleen changed his name to Irving Berlin. And Irving Berlin would not have been the success story he was, an American songwriter, and he was the one who changed the whole genre of coon songs. Now, All Coons Look Alike to Me was written by Ernest Hogan, people assumed that was an Irish-American songwriter. For once it wasn't. It was Ernest Crowder, African-American, changing his name to sound Irish to write that kind of a song. This deserves a lot of examination in Irish studies and indeed in all American studies. A very troubled relationship. But it was Irving Berlin, not that the term ragtime hadn't been used before Irving Berlin's time. It was kind of creeping into the lexicon. But after he wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band, there were no more coon songs ever. It never referred to. If you look in Google it, and you'll see that American songs that were called coon songs. I mean, that was an official designated title. And it's the most uncomfortable title that I have to encounter, and I often try to interrogate that term with my African-American colleague, Lenny Sloan. But when Irving Berlin, and again a work of genius like George M. Cohan's invoking of the three notes of the bugle call to write the most popular song of his time, and Alexander's Ragtime Band, and if you want to hear the Swanee River fade in, ragtime, that's the Scotch snap, jump, the octave jump, and it's the only word in that phrase that's not in syncopation. Total genius. It's like inverting the obvious, and that's a small little example of Irving Berlin's genius. And from the moment he writes this in 1911, ragtime replaces the other obnoxious term in American popular culture, and we have ragtime as an official title, go along with jazz, which emerges in its fullest form, of course, in the 1920s. So Irving Berlin, you can't understand his story without going back to 1873, to the Nevada mines, silver mines. There's this immigrant, John Mackey from Dublin, very restless soul, and he goes out in 1859 to the California gold rush. He's always late for everything, and he scrabbles around for years, and in 1873 he's about to give it up. He's in Virginia City, Nevada, and he's a small little silver mine, and suddenly it starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. He discovers the Comstock Lode, which was to become forever known after as the Big Bonanza. Becomes the first big Irish-American multi-millionaire, preceding Marcus Daly in Butte, Montana. A restless soul comes to New York here with his millions, with his Irish wife, wants to be part of society. No way. They're not having it here in New York. His wife's been a maid, and she's a Catholic. No way. So they move to Paris, and the marriage goes on the rocks. He comes back to America, and he can't find common cause or company anywhere. He becomes one of the most lonely people. Never kind of a company. He's too rich for poorer people. They resent him, and he's not well educated enough for the literati. And he wanted maybe one of the most lonely millionaires ever. But his son Clarence Mackey is not a bit like that. He comes back to New York, and he has now inherited the fortunes of his father, associated with the Trans-Pacific Cable, and one of the great multimillionaires in American society. And he's here in New York. His daughter is one of the great intellectuals of New York. She moves to Greenwich Village, Ellen Mackey, and she smokes cigars and cigarettes, drinks champagne, lives on Sullivan Street, and writes to the New Yorker. I've all the books that she wrote, and they're very nice to read. And she could have any man, the first Irish-American Catholic debutante in the history of the city. Could have any man in America. Who did she pick? Irving Berlin. And her father's furious, and he disinherits her. And he's having a hard year because his wife runs away with the family surgeon, and he's forced to elope with his mistress. It was really tough year for poor Clarence. So anyway, along comes the Great Depression, and guess who loses the most money in the Great Depression, if anybody, is Clarence Mackey. Guess who bails him out? Irving Berlin. I'd like to finish this modest little presentation, which is a celebration of the potential of America for groups on the edge to become part of the centre, for people to come together. But this extraordinary Irish-Jewish marriage, and it was one of the big scandals of the 20s, people, an interfaith marriage, we'd use the other term today, and the controversy it caused, in a sense, Irving Berlin giving up officially his Jewishness in terms of one way of looking at it, but he never lost his affinity for Jewish causes, being a great philanthropist. And they were married for 62 years. He attributes all his success to the company that they shared. Ellen Mackey and Irving Berlin, and when she died at the age of 85, he died 1 year later. He was heartbroken at the age of 101. I'd like to finish this modest presentation with this kind of celebration of the Irish-Jewish connection. And funnily enough, I don't think there's anything in the census to show how many Irish and Jewish marriages there are. But ever since I made the CD, it's the best-selling CD, if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews, I've had more people come up to me and say, we're Irish and Jewish, we've been married for 35, 40, 50 years, and we're having a great time still. So whatever, it works, it seems to work. And thank you for coming along this evening.